Hello again. So in the first part of this segment, I talked about democracies, direct democracies, and republics. But as you know, there are other types of governments around the world. Those are generally, we can put them in the category of non-democracies, right? And so in this mini lecture, we're going to discuss some types of non-democracies and talk about how do we measure freedom, or how do we measure if a country is democratic or how democratic a country is. So the first thing is that we need to know that there are authoritarian governments. There are governments that are certainly non-democratic. And there are some of them that are purely authoritarian. Other are some combination between what would be authoritarian regime and something that may look like a democracy. We have examples of communist countries such as North Korea and Cuba. We have Iran, who is a theocracy. And we have countries that have military rule. Most recently, we saw the military coup that took power in Myanmar, which was under military rule. Then the military let democracy try to flourish for a little bit, and that arguably failed, and now the military is back in power again. All of those regimes are authoritarian regimes. The people don't really have a say, and in fact the government intrudes into people's life a lot more than what we are used to. There are some things that are common in all authoritarian regimes, in all authoritarian governments. Many times they rely on force. Sometimes those are just threats. Sometimes you see actual brutality and force used in terms of violence, suppressing protest, jailing dissenters, and in general, it's a police state. There are no elections, or if there are elections, they're not free, they're not fair. You don't see competition between candidates, or a lot of people cannot even become candidates, only if they get the approval of the ruler or the ruling group. Authoritarian regimes do not appreciate opposition or dissent of any kind. You're not allowed to speak against the regime. You're not allowed to ask questions. And because of that, there's also control of the media, and there is no free press. There's also no freedom of association. There is no civil society. You can't organize in trade unions or youth movements that are not under the rule of the government and are not serving the goals of the government. So by consolidating power and using actual force and limiting the freedoms and liberties of people all around, the government can rule over the people. It is important to note that sometimes there was a legitimate reason for a military to take power. Sometimes there was a lot of unrest, maybe a civil war, and you need this authoritative moment to calm things down. But in all of those countries that are still under authoritative regimes, it's not a temporary moment, but it lasts for a long time. Other non-democracies that we have, or that we can see, are part of this family of monarchies. And monarchies could be constitutional, and in those constitutional monarchies, we still have a monarch, a king, a queen, a prince, a sultan, however they are called, with a hereditary line. But at the same time, by now, like in the UK, for example, the queen mostly hold ceremonial powers. And a lot of the decision-making or the real power rests in elected institutions, either a parliament or some sort of another arrangement that looks a lot more like a democracy. So we can have a democracy that has a monarch on top of everything. And a lot of the monarchies that we have today, Spain, Sweden, the UK, the Netherlands, a lot of them do fall under this group. But there's also the other side of absolute monarchies. And here, the monarch with the hereditary line that runs in the family is completely in power and controls everything, all the decision making. The monarch is the head of state, the ceremonial part, but also the head of government, the actual governing part of things. And sometimes you do see sharing of power with other institutions, but those again are not elected institutions, or mostly not elected institutions, but they tend to be religious institutions. That's the example of Saudi Arabia. And the reason to share power with those religious institutions is that every leader, as we talked in the past, needs some sort of legitimacy. And if you are relying on the religious institutions, you get your legitimacy from faith or, God-given kind of legitimacy. Another thing that we see in a lot of the absolute monarchies that are still in power, and again, let's look at Saudi Arabia or at Brunei. The rulers focus on living conditions and economic growth of the country. So they try to keep the people happy. People that are well-fed, that have social services, that enjoy economic benefits may not rise to ask to be part of the government more so. And then we have this group of countries that we can call the illiberal democracies. They might look like democracy. They hold elections, but there is no real competition. The candidates are pre-chosen. A lot of time there's no term limits, especially on the high-level decision makers. And every rule and institutionalized process favors the incumbent. So look at countries like Russia or Singapore, for example. So that not necessarily means that life are bad there. If you look at Singapore, a lot of people will say life is good, but it's not really a liberal democracy. The other thing is that we see less or really little protections for civil and political rights, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, these kinds of things, and no real tolerance of opposition that includes some sort of control over the media. Right, so we have those authoritative regimes, we have monarchies, we have illiberal democracies, but we also have democracies. And democracies are different. Some of them are freer than others. And there are countries that we call countries in transition. Maybe they were under a monarchy and now they try to become a constitutional monarchy, or maybe they were under an authoritative regime such as Myanmar, trying to move over and democratize, become a democracy. So we need to look at the structure and the design of the political system and the electoral system of the country, but also about the freedoms, the liberties, the political liberties that people have. And now, luckily, we have an organization that calls Freedom House, and this is a non-profit organization, very well respected around the world, that provides an annual report every year for all the countries in the world. You can visit their website and see reports on each country and also see how free the world is. We'll take a snapshot of that in a minute. Freedom House rates countries on a scale of 100 points. The more points, the more free. The less points, the less free. 40 points go on indicators. It's a list of 10 questions that measure political rights, and 60 points go on civil liberties. So if you look at this map over here, the green color represents free countries, or what we will probably call liberal democracies. Partially free are in yellow, and not free countries, all the certainly authoritative regimes, either military regime, theocracies, dictatorship, all kinds of those regimes would be in purple. So I do invite you to go and play a little bit with Freedom House and see how countries fall on that scale. One interesting point would be to look, of course, on the United States. I would be curious for you to check this out and let me know what you think about how well Freedom House have rated the United States. So this is a little review of non-democratic countries and this idea of how do we measure freedom in the world. I'll see you in our next session.